carbon-intensive resource. So my feeling is that coal and gas companies, particularly from an export-oriented perspective, have known that they need to invest considerably in protecting their industry. So they put that extra dollar in, they've thrown in a few extra dollars into lobbying, into public relations, into government affairs. That you wouldn't have done if you were just an ordinary, kind of business in an economy and just ordinary industry. But they knew that they had a problem. They would have known they've got a problem since the 80s. So they've really invested long term. So the people who know that climate change is a real problem are the fossil fuel industry. And you know that because of the way they treat the public relations. And you can tell, when we've got like an anti-wind, this anti-wind campaign, it looks really huge and is achieving 2 kilometre boundaries around wind turbines, where anyone within 2 kilometres can veto it. So basically locking down New South Wales and Victoria so there's no wind. And if a Liberal government wins in South Australia, it'll be, we're even talking about 5 kilometre limit. Okay? 5 kilometre limit. And Denmark fits 5 times into Victoria. Now I'm not sure what that is in Queensland, it might be 30 times or something. There's a lot of Denmarks in Queensland, okay? So 5 times in Victoria. And Denmark has 3,000 turbines on shore. Germany has 20,000 turbines on shore. In fact, we can get an idea of how big they are. Look at that map. Here we go. So, where's Germany? Right, they've got 20,000 turbines in Germany, and they keep building more wind turbines. Now, we've basically got government policy coming in that's halting wind turbines. Now, it's a serious industry, it's a real industry, they're basically benign when compared to coal-fired power plants. Coal-fired power plants are killers. My brother's the head of surgical oncology and cardiothoracic surgery at St Vincent's in Melbourne. And if he's not seeing a cigarette smoker for lung cancer, then he's seeing someone from Latrobe Valley who's dying of asbestosis mesothelioma, because the plants, instead of saying they've got asbestos in them, they say no asbestos on the bits of the plant that say that don't have asbestos, because asbestos is the rule, okay? They've got these green lines that say no asbestos on this pipe, It's shocking, and these people are getting exposed to asbestos and they're dying. So this is all, with the exception of 2 of the plants there, Loyang A and B, the rest of them are riddled with asbestos. So you'd be closing those down if you had a heart or if you're a community that cared for people, because they're industrial sites that are dangerous. So how is it that the roaring noise of that, the encroachment on farms, they keep taking over farms for coal mines, they destroy water tables, these mines flood and they pump the water out in a hurry during floods, that they release mercury, cadmium, the dust causes increased vectors of lung cancer. So in Hunter Valley right now, Beyond Zero Emissions has been working on an epidemiological study with University of Sydney on lung disease in the area. It's a much higher vector of that. So you've got all those problems, and yet coal's great in Australia. Fantastic. If I'm Martin Ferguson, I'll be happy to boast that I sprinkle it on my breakfast. But to install a wind turbine, boy, that's a horrible thing to do. They're pretty ugly, those wind turbines, and we can imagine that they've got a sound you can't hear infrasound. They tried the sound that you could hear, and that didn't stick with the public because everyone went by the wind turbines and found out they didn't make much noise. So now they've gone with infrasound. It's the insidious sound that you can't hear. That's the and the wind turbines are marching across the landscape. It's like thousands of them, they're coming to get you. But in Germany, like in Denmark, there's 3,000, and they're quite happy there. They're so happy in Denmark with their wind turbines that they're going to 50% of their power from wind. Now they've had a while to consider this, okay? We've got 3,000 turbines, they've got the biggest dairying industry in Europe, and the cows aren't having epileptic fits. I've heard of that one in Victoria. We've got epileptic fit cows, but the Danes keep producing milk in their farms, right? So they're willing to go 50% wind, and it just tells you that the issue is not community engagement. It's not one of communities of NIMBYs and people having a problem with it. Yes, they have community engagement issues, but they're minor, and the communities get over them once the wind turbines are in. Here we've got surveys that show that 85% of people support wind. And you do have the odd person when they hear it's a wind farm coming, it's not on their land, they're not happy, they don't want to look at someone else who's making $10,000 for a wind turbine. They complain, people complain about a housing development that might happen in Ipswich, but I'm sure a bit of community consultation goes on, and most of the time the housing developments go ahead. Right? But if it's a coal mine or a gas mine taking over some farm and bumping farming in Australia, well, a 28-day court notice, or in New South Wales, in Queensland, 50 days, and bang, bad luck. If you deny access, then that farmer's in jail. That's the law in Queensland. With a wind turbine in New South Wales, 2 kilometre veto right. So the state of play here is that the fossil fuel industry has invested big time in owning this country, and they've got reins on the government. They make donations to political parties, and at the same time they have royalty payments. So instead of political parties having to choose to tax people to pay for proper services, to provision the things that we need, which is schools and hospitals and health and roads, they can be bad managers, be hopeless managers, and just live off the mining royalties and subsidise their operations that way. So they're basically addicted. Governments are addicted, and in course we're addicted to mining, and we need to decouple from that. And a good way to start is to eliminate fossil fuel exports and stick to the things we need in the 21st century economy, so things like gold and copper and aluminium, things we actually need we can stick with. Those things that we don't need. And it's a good time to do that because the Australian dollar is just too high to make many other industries in Australia viable. Only, what percentage of the workforce, is a question for the audience, what percentage of the workforce is in the energy and resources sector? Like, how many people?
Yes, 2%.
Okay. It was meant to be for that people didn't know. Anyway, most people come up, they did a survey and the average answer was 16% of people work in that sector. Okay? And the reality is less than 2%. 190,000 Australians work in domestic energy provision, in resource extraction, energy extraction. So 190,000 people. There are 11.5 million working Australians. So if you get the 850,000 people in manufacturing, and a lot of them are working in existing plants that were built back when we either had it protected or our labour costs were internationally competitive. So they built those factories. They still operate today because it's not that easy to relocate the actual plant overseas, so you're just paying for the labour. The actual plant's not really worth much because it only just makes money. You couldn't build a new one, pay off the debt and employ the people. And so we're just getting bumped over the edge where you can't even afford to employ the people and run those plants and to get the inputs. And what's doing that? High Australian dollar. And I said to my future in-laws, who are farmers in the Liverpool Plain, National Party members, I was sort of saying to my future father-in-law, saying, all right, so the National Party, you guys have always been pretty keen to make ports more efficient and sort of, try and get labour costs down to get your commodity out to port because, it might be costing you $10 a tonne or something. And he sort of said, okay, we want labour reform at ports. That's sort of the agenda of people in the National Party. He said, you agree with that? He wasn't, and I said, okay, well, fair enough. And then I said, well, the coal miners who not only trying to take over part of your land and the coal seam gas guys, they're setting the dollar so high that they're whacking the equivalent of $150 a tonne, or $200 a tonne, or $300 a tonne. So before they were willing to go to war, these farmers were willing to, we're going to get out, we're going to make $5 a tonne more because there's inefficiency in the port. And say, well, what are you doing? Why aren't you going to protect your $200 a tonne? Which is what it's effectively costing them because their commodity, their production costs are so much higher now, and they make so much less in Australian terms because they've got to compete with a higher Australian dollar. So it's bad for farming, it's bad for tourism because Australians get a high dollar. We just go overseas for our holidays, and overseas people don't come here because we're too expensive. It's bad for manufacturing because we can't afford to manufacture here anymore. We were pretty bad before, but now we're really bad in terms of international competitiveness. So there's only a few winners, and they are companies which are 86% foreign owned. 86% foreign owned. So not owned by shareholders in Australia, they're owned 86% foreign owned. They're like Peabody Coal, Xstrata, Rio, BHP. BHP, the big Australian, is actually the big Brit. I keep hearing it's the big Australian. I go, well, 20% sort of big Australian, but the rest is the big Brit. And the big Brit, okay, I'll give you an example with Xstrata. So when Xstrata sells coal to a Chinese buyer, the Chinese buyer pays Xstrata, they convert Chinese yuan to Swiss francs, and they pay Xstrata $130 a tonne. Then Australia gets $30 a tonne or $20 a tonne, and it repatriates that to Australia to pay for royalties and to pay for running the mines. And then they get the whole $130 a tonne and they report it on Australian GDP. Then the government says to us, we're doing so well, look at our ranking in GDP. We've been selling this coal for $130 a tonne, but actually $100 a tonne never ever came to Australia. Okay? It doesn't come to Australia. The super profits tax would have probably got us addicted more, but would have gone some way to that, because whatever the floating price of the coal was, we'd take a greater cut. But those mines were viable when coal was being sold for $20 or $30 a tonne, so we know what it costs to run those coal mines. It doesn't cost $50 a tonne, it doesn't cost $60 a tonne, it doesn't cost $40 a tonne, it costs, some of them run at $10 a tonne, $20 a tonne, $30 a tonne. So keep that in mind, we're being sold a pup. When they say that they're a $50 billion contributor to GDP, well, we only really get $10 billion of that, okay?
So, you talked in the early part of the presentation about more of a ground level education that you were trying to achieve through what you're doing. Do you feel that that what the work that you're doing, becoming policy, is not part of that?
Say again.
So, at the beginning of the presentation, you talked about.
Here we go.
Beginning of the presentation, you talked about ground level education for the community, scout groups and things like that. I'm just wondering, is not the work that you're doing, the goal here is to become policy of like national policy for the government? Is that?
Yeah. So look, the aim is for something approaching what we're proposing to become policy. I mean, this is our scenario. It's our best effort of quite a big group of pretty talented people. So we think it's pretty good. It's not saying it's the best thing out there. One medium-term win for us would be if other groups linked to universities or the CSIRO or the government commissioned other reports like ours. However, had something that I don't think will be quite the win that could be, but as out of the Clean Energy Future Package, the Greens negotiated the Australian Energy Market Operator, who looks after the electricity grid, to do a study into 100% renewable power Australia. So one thing we're doing right now, we're trying to keep that honest. There's a few tricks going along. We've got a lot of people who work inside DRES in the department, and they also work the Energy Market Operator and all sorts of places, and and they work in the energy companies, and we hear what's going on, and we've heard that that isn't being taken seriously, and that and they want to have we'll go 100% renewables, we'll go to gas first, and that's that's not the intention of what was asked for, modelling 100% renewable grid. So if Germany can install 3,000 megawatts of PV in a month, and Denmark can go for 50% wind, then we can certainly get our energy market operator to model up a grid running on that. Because they're not just modelling in those countries, they're modelling it and rolling it out. So, they're that many steps ahead of us. But that's what we're doing. I mean, we're doing this in lieu of the government doing it. If the government was doing this, I mean, if I was imagining I was a campaigner in Spain trying to get renewables, I'd have to stop getting excited first and refocus the government towards achieving their targets faster, or the same in Germany or Denmark or somewhere. But here, it's kind of good to be a campaigner because there's a lot to be achieved. And ultimately, government policy is what's going to drive. It has always driven our energy sector. That'll be the driver. I mean, government decides anything from planning where ports will be, where large energy users will be, smelters, and government's plan where say yes or no to LNG trains. They say yes or no to they build coal-fired power plants and they finance them with government bonds. So government's always played a considerable role. In this day and age, it tends to be government regulation leading private investment, but still needs to be led by government regulation and government decisions. So I don't see that changing from the way it's always been to it being the way now. Name a country that has rolled an energy infrastructure out without the government doing it. All these